Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 1110. This is your in-depth lecture for week 2, where we are going to cover, kind of taking a deep dive into the readings that you've had for this week, as well as the music videos. And we're going to kind of plug in different additional resources that are going to help us to make sense of the concepts, the themes, and really just help us to build towards this week's assignment, which is discussion board post number 2. Now, again, this week is intended as a point of entry into thinking about Americanness. It is not intended to kind of be the end-all be-all to how we're thinking about what that is comprised of. Rather, we're using this week's materials as a way into starting this discussion. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. And so what I've given you for today in terms of a title is close reading music videos, because that's really also where we're starting in terms of kind of first steps into analysis as well. Now, of course, with week 1, you had a few different options to work off of in terms of primary sources, but this week we're going to kind of concentrate on music videos as a really salient option for thinking about how pop culture interfaces with larger questions and just dialogues that are happening around what it means to be included in or excluded from a definition of Americanness. Now, if you recall from the course description in the syllabus and from what I mentioned last week in the lecture, we are using kind of the Made in the USA label as our symbol of sorts to get us started in thinking about these larger questions. Now, this does not mean that we are remaining entirely tethered to the symbol all semester, but rather it's sort of a way for us to kind of materially and simply just begin to think about what is included in a definition of something being made in the USA, right? So as I mentioned before, you might have seen this label or a label like it, on clothing, on items, on a whole range of things that you can potentially buy and consume. And of course, we know that this is not unique to the US. We're going to see this kind of sticker represented on goods to kind of indicate to us where exactly this product was manufactured. So we know that it can also say, made in China, made in Indonesia, made in Canada, so on and so forth. But today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about how the articles are engaging with this question of what constitutes Americanness in terms of a commodity or product. And we're going to use that as a way to bridge towards talking about how the music videos for this week visually inform kind of our understandings of Americanness and how we might recognize it in pop culture. So when we think about this Made in America label, it can take a couple of different forms, right? It can kind of look a few different ways. Oftentimes we'll see it represented with the American flag. And this, of course, is something that visually for us is going to really emphasize kind of the punctuation of made in America, made in USA, right? It's incorporating a recognizable symbol of Americanness, which is the American flag, into how exactly this message is being conveyed in such a quick and brief capacity to the viewer and consumer. Now, before I kind of dive in a little bit further, I wanted to include this kind of suggested series of approaches to the in-depth lecture, and this is the case for this week as well as in moving forward. And so I include this because, given that this in-depth lecture is very long, it's recommended that you approach it and other in-depth lectures for the course in one of the following ways. You don't have to do this, of course, but these are sort of 3 suggestions I have for you of how you might think about kind of just budgeting your time with in-depth lectures. So the first suggestion is watch the lecture in one sitting, take breaks to stretch and or get a snack. You will see reminders to do so. I will also occasionally pause in my in-depth lectures so I can get a drink of water and just pause, because talking for 45 minutes to an hour obviously can really wear out my voice. The second suggestion is that you watch the lecture in 2 sittings. Plan to watch sections 1 to 3 on one day and sections 4 to 6 on another day. I have the sections organized in our table of contents that I'll show here in a moment. But this is kind of a suggestion that if you're someone who can't sit and watch and retain the information from a 45-minute to hour lecture, it might be useful to kind of spend 2 days watching the lecture and break it into chunks so that you can kind of deal with the first half of the lecture on one day and the second half of the lecture another day. And finally, another suggestion I have for you would be to watch the lecture in 3 sittings. Plan to watch sections 1 to 3 on one day, sections 4 to 5 on another day, and section 6 on the third day. This is ideal if you are someone who's really missing that Monday, Wednesday, Friday format for college classes, or if you just find that it would be helpful to break a large lecture into 3 chunks and kind of have a time each week that you just sit down and watch the lecture. Given that we are obviously an asynchronous online delivery for this course, we don't necessarily have that kind of infrastructure built in for you, but you can certainly mimic one if you find that that would be most conducive for you actually engaging with all of the material, okay? So these are my 3 suggestions for how you might approach in-depth lectures from kind of this week and going forward. If you find that you're struggling for whatever reason to retain information or just be engaged, check in with me and we can kind of talk about other strategies. I'm happy to talk about those with you. So on the agenda for today, we are talking about defining America and Americans. So what exactly comes to mind when we might think about Americanness? We want to do a pause and recap of Dennis Green's article, which you read for today. Excuse me. We also want to do a pause and watch of ABC News segments from 2011 and 2014. I note here that while you watch these segments, I encourage you to stretch and or get a snack. I also have a pause and recap of Alyssa Mertes' article and a pause and watch of CBS News and WMAR2 news segments. Again, I also recommend that you stretch and or get a snack during those segments. And then finally, visualizing definitions of Americanness. I do encourage you to watch all of the additional YouTube videos that I plug into lectures. I know that they make the lecture longer, but I've generally found that students who do kind of take that extra time to watch the supplemental links that I provide generally have a more refined understanding of concepts and themes than if you were to just kind of blow through the lecture without pausing to do that additional work, okay? So let's start with defining America and Americans. Now, if we were in person, generally what I would do is kind of with the chalkboards that we typically have in the classroom, I would ask you to kind of help me brainstorm what comes to mind for you when you hear the terms America and Americans. Now, I also in kind of an in-person class would say, I want you to kind of tell me all of the things that come up to you that maybe feel stereotypical or cliche or like tropes. But I also definitely encourage students to kind of think about, are there negative connotations that come up when you see these words, right? We don't want to necessarily embrace only a positive view of Americanness this semester, because doing so would actually limit the critical inquiry we can do into how pop culture is engaging with Americanness. And it would also prohibit us from recognizing that not everyone's relationship to or perception of Americanness is positive. Okay, but just to kind of get us started, when we think about America and Americanness, and if we were to start to try to break apart the facets of it or how one might go about, kind of assigning definitions to America and Americanness, oftentimes useful categories can be taste, touch, smell, sound, sight, and feeling or emotion. And kind of these 6 approaches to these terms can be really helpful as a way into trying to think about what exactly comes to mind for you when you think about these particular terms. So I've included a couple of examples here, not to say that these are the end all be all and the exclusive things that can come to mind for you, but these are kind of common ones that I've observed in kind of the past few years of teaching this course, common responses I get from students. So many students will cite, fireworks or the 4th of July as kind of a visual and a holiday that can really help to kind of just kind of solidify a time of year when people tend to really be encouraged to embrace a patriotic or kind of love of country view of Americanness. Another popular response I get from students is oftentimes superheroes like Captain America or America Chavez from the Marvel Comics universe. We of course see with kind of Disney Plus's ongoing expansion of the MCU that we are getting more and more superheroes that kind of come to the foreground. But generally, I find that students will often think about Captain America, given that kind of the name America is included in his title. But superheroes have a long legacy of being kind of folded into how one talks about Americanness and also kind of thinks about countries' borders, defenses, patriotism, and so on. Oftentimes students will also mention apple pie or other American foods that, either show up in sayings like, they're as American as apple pie, or will kind of show up when people think about, is there really a specific cuisine that one could assign to the US? Fast food and name brand corporations oftentimes also get referenced as well when we think about just kind of the vast landscape of consumerism, which we'll talk about this semester. Diversity of people and diversity of opinions oftentimes comes up alongside the US as a melting pot of nationalities, cultures, and ethnicities. And this image I've pulled here is from Schoolhouse Rock, which is a series that kind of teaches children about a variety of topics. And they do one about kind of the US government and Americanness. And this visual of a melting pot and kind of this notion of a diverse country are terms that come up quite a bit from politicians, that come up in daily life, that come up in pop culture, right? Oftentimes we hear these terms invoked as well when you see someone kind of perhaps trying to explain away structural oppression or trying to argue that kind of racism and such is not possible to exist, which we know, as we'll talk about in later weeks, is indeed structurally embedded. So you cannot explain away racism or oppression, right? But I include these examples here, not only because they come up often in students' responses, but also because when we think about diversity, sometimes there's a conflation of diversity and equality, which is not necessarily the case, right? Just because people of color or people from various nationalities or cultures, ethnicities, and so on are present, doesn't necessarily mean that they are being treated justly in that space, okay? Adjust my light because it keeps flickering. Another kind of common reference that I hear from students is the White House and US political parties. Oftentimes also kind of the Republican versus Democratic parties come up in these conversations, as well as military service and veterans. We see those images represented quite often in discussions of Americanness, typically in relationship to patriotism, and then farmland and rural America as being kind of a landscape that, you know, in country music, for example, shows up quite prominently, but when we think about other US productions, oftentimes is erased or not as visible, or is stereotyped in ways that are not necessarily kind of nuanced. I also oftentimes hear students reference things like US landmarks, such as the Statue of Liberty, and kind of those visual cues that we have in terms of, you know, what one might think of in terms of a region or location. Sports is also a popular one, right? And thinking about kind of the US culture around watching sports or playing sports. We have celebrities and movies and mainstream media, which we will talk quite a bit about this semester in terms of how celebrities and mainstream media participate in facilitating conversations about Americanness, protest and freedom of speech, which, as we saw last summer with the uprisings, and as we've really seen across the 2010s with the rise of Black Lives Matter and other political movements, we recognize that and kind of associate with Americanness a permission to protest, though as we have seen in the media in the last few years, the kind of contours of what's perceived of as legitimate protest versus kind of illegitimate protest is something that has a lot of conflict and a lot of tension, right? There's definitely not necessarily a singular narrative wrapped around protest, and people in positions of power oftentimes attempt to curtail political movements by trying to enforce kind of a moral code for how one should properly express their dissent, which can be very problematic. American flag clothing, we oftentimes see costuming as being really important for facilitating this, especially around the 4th of July. We also have images like the nuclear family, which, you know, is consists of, I should say, a father, wife, and 2 children. I don't know why I put father and wife. That was supposed to be father and mother, but my brain split. But definitely in the nuclear family configuration, we have kind of this notion that the father is head of the family, head of the you know, household, and that the, you know, mother is kind of situated in this structure as the mother of the children, the wife of the husband, right? She's often relationally represented, not necessarily represented as the kind of lead or protagonist in her own right. And then finally, we get the suburbs and cul-de-sacs with identical or similar houses as becoming really popular kind of in the 50s and 60s, as you have folks coming home from war, and many veterans, though not all, are given some sort of financial help to be able to settle down with their families. So all of these examples are meant to kind of lead us into these guiding questions, which for today are going to be, what does it mean if something is quote unquote made in the USA? Why do US consumers care or are encouraged to care if something is produced in the United States? And briefly discuss the 4 music videos you need to watch in preparation for discussion board post number 2. That's going to kind of be how these 2 guiding questions build with us in thinking about these topics. Oops. What we want to consider, though, you know, from this week and in the next couple weeks, is these questions of how music videos bring lyrics to life by visualizing concepts, how artists, musicians, performers create definitions and communities through their art, right? And depending on how they're approaching their text, they may be including or appealing to some audiences and excluding or not appealing to others. And how artists, musicians, and performers can challenge or destabilize what are accepted as conventions. So if a convention is going to be something that is deemed normal or typical or acceptable, how might an artist, musician, or performer perhaps attempt to go against that, or unpack that or change that in some respect, rather than just upholding the social norm? Okay. So let's pause and recap Dennis Green's "Here's What Made in USA Actually Means." Pause this lecture if you have not read the article before engaging with this section. It's going to be beneficial for you to be familiar with the article before engaging with this pause and recap. So I ask for you to just kind of think right now about what is the most important information from Green's article? What bubbled up for you or kind of came up for you in terms of what the topic is, what he's saying about this topic, and any important or crucial details that it seems that he is engaging with. Now, in this article, we know that it's from Business Insider and that it was published in February 2017. And we have kind of these opening paragraphs that read, "There has been no time in recent memory when so much importance was placed on American manufacturing as it is in this moment. President Donald Trump has pushed the issue to the forefront, proclaiming that his government will have two major economic goals: to buy American and hire Americans. He has promised to revive and reshore American manufacturing through creating quote unquote fairer trade deals." So we have this author kind of electing to draw attention for the reader specifically to a recent decision at the time of this writing that Trump had elected to decide to pursue, right? That his goals were going to be to buy American and to hire American. And the reason I wanted to pause and kind of look at these opening paragraphs is because we see that Dennis Green as an author is making a rhetorical move here, that he's not sort of introducing us to this topic of, made in USA labels and codes out of nowhere, right? He's specifically connecting this discussion of American made products to this kind of announcement from Trump of kind of what his priorities are at the time of, this announcement, but also at this point in his presidency. And so for that reason, what Green is doing is he's contextualizing, or he's sort of making clear why this topic is significant to a reader to be familiar with, okay? And this is a technique in your own writing you really want to think about, and we'll talk about this semester, is how do the opening paragraphs allow us to contextualize and make clear what the priorities, the significance, and the focus of this text is going to be, okay? And so given that he kind of transitions to talking about this announcement from Trump in 2017, his first paragraph then, and with article writing, it's a bit different. He only has the one sentence, but his first paragraph, if you will, of "There has been no time in recent memory when so much importance was placed on American manufacturing as it is in this moment." We can see that this introduction helps him to set the stage for how he's going to pursue talking about Trump's announcement. Now, some of the quotes I wanted to pull to kind of talk about is, in this article, Green says, "The item must be made within the United States borders from all or virtually all American parts. That is, with parts also made in the US." Now, what Green is getting at, and that Mertes will also touch upon in her piece, is this question of what constitutes American made. We might use this phrase in kind of a casual or official way, but how exactly are we able to identify this, right? What's the criteria? What's the metric for measuring how exactly a product falls within this categorization or perhaps escapes this categorization, okay? He also says, according to the FTC's website, all or virtually all means that all significant parts and processing that go into the product must be of US origin. That is, the product should contain no or negligible foreign content. So we can see here that Green is kind of recognizing that the phrase all or virtually all is realistically not very clear, right? It's intentionally vague, it's intentionally ambiguous. And so what he's proceeding to do is provide us with some kind of definition to hold on to. And so he's pointing to the Federal Trade Commission to kind of indicate that, as a body that's going to have some say and sway over what exactly counts as American made, we need to recognize that the definition is going to be consisting of all significant parts and processing that go into the product must be of US origin. Now, if you notice, when we have a phrase like significant, and this is part of the reason I also include this language kind of in your discussion board posts and as we go about writing the semester, on its own, significant doesn't necessarily have a kind of clear definition either, right? We can understand that significant is going to be sort of synonymous with important, but saying something important is important, right? Doesn't necessarily give us the full tools to be able to actually say kind of in an educated way, right? What exactly is a significant part? Like, what does it mean for something for a part of something larger to be a significant, important, worth paying attention to, and so on, right? And I hope that you're kind of seeing the connection here, that in your writing, I'm kind of asking you the same question, that you in some respects are having to define or make clear what exactly constitutes a significant, critical, or crucial piece of a larger text, okay? Now, Green also goes on to say, it's important to note that this FTC designation is not considered when the US government is the purchaser. The US government is required to purchase only American-made goods, if possible, according to the Buy American Act that was signed by President Herbert Hoover in 1933. However, any item assembled in the US with more than 50% American-made parts is considered American-made for this purpose, regardless of the FTC definition. Okay, so there are some kind of shades of gray to this rule, and the Federal Trade Commission is able to kind of make some of that a bit more malleable. And so we see that Green is impressing that the US government, right, is going to be required to purchase only American-made goods. But any item assembled in the US with more than 50% American-made parts is considered American-made for this purpose. So let's dive into this a little bit more. So what Green is giving us here is that the product is made by a business or corporation in the US, plus the materials in the product are made in the US. So it's a matter of the larger whole, the product, as well as all of the smaller pieces that comprise it, which are the materials. That's the ideal configuration here for how one would be able to constitute definitively an American-made product. Now, he mentions the Buy American Act, which, as he says, was passed by Congress and signed by President Hoover in 1933. And the Buy American Act emphasizes that federal agencies in the US should prefer to purchase domestic or American materials and products if what is being purchased is intended for public use, the desired products or materials are available in the US and are of good quality. Now, depending on the circumstance, these steps might not always be applicable or followed. That's kind of where that gray area comes in. And the key idea here is that American-made items are preferred by federal agencies. So the government is not going to typically elect to purchase something that's made in China or made in Canada, right? They're kind of, in some respects, going to be recognized as showing support for, domestic companies, showing support for the U.S. economy if they're using U.S. dollars to purchase U.S. goods and services. Okay. This is oftentimes also as well why there's a lot of kind of tension and conflict that comes up around jobs, the economy, what the government is purchasing or where it's putting the money in a particular presidency, right? That ends up being kind of a touchstone of a lot of political campaigns, is how candidates are talking about how they're going to spend money. Now, whenever we are reading an article, and specifically a secondary source, we want to make sure that we are aware of where the information is coming from. So again, Green's piece is published in Business Insider. And they kind of include in their About Us section of the website that it is a fast-growing business site with deep financial, media, tech, and other industry verticals, launched in 2007 by former top-ranked Wall Street analyst Henry Blodgett and DoubleClick executives Dwight Merriman and Kevin Ryan. The site is now the largest business news site on the web. Business Insider was acquired by German media company Axel Springer SE in September 2015. So it's important to kind of look to, with a secondary source, which this is sometimes a bit more doable in electronic sources compared to print sources. We want to be attentive to who is publishing this, what other types of content did they publish, what are the credentials of the author, right? We want to be really aware of who are we consulting and where we're getting our information, which of course, as we've seen in the last few years, has also emerged as a key feature of how politicians are talking about just kind of public consciousness around misinformation, around kind of consulting correct sources, right? And we'll kind of think about that a little bit more as the semester goes on, but it is relevant and crucial that you are consulting sources that are very much kind of not only speaking on topics in a very educated and clear manner, but that they are also employing or kind of sourcing their articles and so on to writers who are also doing their due diligence in research and have the credentials to write on things. Now, Dennis Green's bio on the Business Insider website reads that he is an editor at Business Insider, primarily overseeing visual features coverage of consumer and tech companies. We also get his social media handle and his email. So we know that he has an established position, which also lets us know that we'll be able to kind of see what other things he has written. Now, I kind of screenshot a few of these here. These are from last year. I did not elect to update this screenshot, so I apologize in advance. But some of the topics he's talked about in the past include, kind of how he's talking about Silicon Valley. He's talking about Michael Bloomberg. He's writing about kind of the Hamptons and different business issues, right? So he is clearly writing across the board about kind of different key players, major businesses, major topics and issues that emerge in kind of business overall, right? So it makes sense that he is writing these pieces for Business Insider, but we can also see that he's clearly someone who's very well versed on a variety of business topics and subsections of business. Now, this marks a lengthy lecture intermission. If you recall from the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned that if you elect to watch this lecture all the way through, that is one approach, or you could break it into 2 or 3 pieces. So I have made a note here that this would be an appropriate moment if you are someone who is planning to stretch or eat a snack while watching these videos. Please go ahead and do so, or perhaps pause this lecture, go get that snack, go stretch, and then come back. But this pause and watch news segment is one that I've included here, and it's from ABC News in 2011, and it's a video segment in which they talk about a family that assumes that everything that they're purchasing, right, is made in America because of the sticker or the logo and so on. And it's a really interesting kind of feature in which they talk about how exactly the consumer might make an assumption about how they're supporting larger US interests based on their purchasing choices, but in fact are, perhaps purchasing things that aren't actually as American made as they are assuming them to be. The second pause and watch segment is from ABC News in 2014, and it kind of gives us a little bit more insight into how exactly these, gives us a little bit more insight into kind of this Made in America term. I also highly encourage you to watch it. I know that it's 7 minutes, but it's a really interesting concentrated feature on talking about how exactly one can approach recognizing the nuances and shades of Made in America as a label, as kind of a way that consumers might be inspired to purchase things, but in fact are maybe purchasing things that don't match up to their expectations. Now let's go ahead and dive into this pause and recap number 2. And this is for Alyssa Mertes' The Truth About Made in the USA Products. Again, I want you to think as we kind of dive into this next section a little bit more about, what are the kind of topics, what are the interests of Alyssa Mertes in this piece, right? What is she saying about this topic? And I want you to think about, what's the most important information that kind of comes up or rises up for you as you are reading this piece. Now, as I mentioned last week, or I should say actually in the overview lecture, this piece is quite long compared to the Dennis Green. It's also formatted quite differently than the Dennis Green. And as I mentioned before, it's been updated. And this kind of piece that we're looking at is a little bit different than the Dennis Green. In some respects, you can recognize this more to be a blog post compared to a formal article. And I'll get into that in a second. But with Alyssa Mertes, she opens her piece by saying, do you want your products as American as apple pie and a good old-fashioned game of baseball? There are many items you can buy that have the Made in the USA label. Still, it's not as cut and dry as you might think. Some items receive the label but still have imported parts, while others are 100% made in the country. So you'll notice that her opening is much different than the Dennis Green, and that she's kind of opening with a very broad net. Right, she's asking us a question. She's kind of using this question as a lead in to talking about, who is her intended audience, folks who would sort of agree with or affirm this question that she's posing at the beginning. And then she kind of proceeds to unpack or kind of analyze the nuances of Made in the USA as a label that we would see on things. Now, as Mertes walks us through, sometimes a product will say Made in the USA because it is produced in the US, but the materials are produced somewhere else. This is where it gets tricky, right? As Dennis Green introduced us to, the ideal scenario here is that the larger product and the smaller pieces that make up that product are all American made. However, as we start, as we start to see some nuances for here, right? You might see the final product say American made, but the materials are kind of obscured from us and being able to know that they are not actually American made themselves. Now, so Mertes goes into this discussion of qualified and unqualified claim for made in the USA. And it gets a little tricky here, but we're going to kind of walk through this slowly. A qualified made in USA claim describes the extent, amount, or type of a product's domestic content or processing. It indicates that the product isn't entirely of domestic origin. So for example, 60% US content, made in USA of US and imported parts, or couch assembled in USA from Italian leather and Mexican frame. So a qualified claim then is going to be a claim that is attentive to the extent to which something is American made, right? So it describes the extent, the amount, or type of a product's domestic content or processing. So it is very aware and clear about the extent to which, or the amount of which, the final product is made of US manufactured items and materials, okay? Now, what's important about qualified claims for made in the USA is that it indicates that the product isn't entirely of domestic origin. So it's relatively upfront about the fact that part of what you're buying was made in the US, but part of it was not in terms of the materials, okay? So we can see that with 60% US content, we're getting a percentage or degree to which US content or materials is included in the final product. We can also see this with made in USA of US and imported parts, that kind of the manufacturing part of made in USA is foregrounded. And then the US and imported parts portion of this sentence is giving us the kind of material side of things, right? Some of the materials are from here, but some of them are not. And then finally, couch assembled in USA. That's once again foregrounding kind of where the product was manufactured. And then ending with from Italian leather and Mexican frame indicates for us that the content or the materials that went into that couch that was assembled in the US are not American made. Now, Mertes gives us this first scenario of an Apple product or like an iPhone or an iPad that says designed in California and assembled in China. Now, she says that the manufacturer can claim that it is made in the USA by being explicit about how the product's functionality, the idea for how it works, was created in the US, and the only characteristic that is not domestic is that it was assembled elsewhere. So this is kind of a technicality, right? So she's telling us that, you know, they can argue that it's American made because the idea for it came about in the US, but it was manufactured or put together elsewhere. Very tricky, but it is indeed a way that somebody could kind of on a technicality be able to argue that sort of the content is American made, but the form comes to us from elsewhere. Now, unqualified claim for made in the USA is a bit different. She tells us that an unqualified claim that a product is made in the USA should have and rely on a reasonable basis to support the claim at the time it is made. This means a manufacturer or marketer needs competent and reliable evidence to back up the claim that its product is all or virtually all made in the US. Now, it's important to note here that this can be slightly deceptive because virtually all operates on a technicality. So we really do have technicalities happening with both of these, but especially with unqualified claims, it's really, really tricky. So if a qualified claim is all about being kind of to some extent as transparent as possible and being like, this came from here, this came from here, this came from here, and kind of that meticulous listing. Unqualified claims are all about, having to demonstrate, most of, if not all of the materials that went into this product are from the US. So it's really trying to strive for that whole. Now we get the second scenario to help us understand this from Mertes, where she puts a grill is made in North Carolina, but the materials are imported from Mexico. Now, she says that this product can claim being made in the USA if they argue that the major parts of it were domestically made and only small parts were made outside of the US. So this would be a matter of them saying, kind of the largest or sort of most significant, right, to use that phrase again, or kind of most needed parts to make that grill operate are from the US and just some other parts are from Mexico. So it's going to really be that the manufacturer is having to prove or argue that, everything that's significant or kind of the big parts or the most crucial are American made to the extent that the Mexican made parts aren't as kind of not that they're not as relevant, but sort of they don't have as much bearing on the product. Okay. So again, this is where the technicality comes in, is that, somebody who's making an unqualified claim that something is made in the USA is really trying to argue that it's like the all or virtually all, right? It's so much of it is American made that the parts that are not don't really matter. Whereas somebody who's making a qualified claim about made in the USA is trying to kind of make clear to us that, there are parts of it that are not necessarily American made, but we can kind of understand the extent to which, or the amount to which, it is American made. So qualified claim aiming to show the degree to which something is American made and thus be included in that label. Unqualified claim is arguing that it is so almost like basically perfectly American made that the parts that are not don't count or shouldn't count. Very weird, I know. Now, this piece from Alyssa Mertes comes to us from Quality Logo Products, which if you go to look at their kind of About Us section of the website, it reads, "We may not have a delicious chocolate waterfall and giant gummy bears, but we have the golden ticket when it comes to a top-notch branding experience. If you want your logo printed on pens, t-shirts, mugs, or other custom merchandise, you're in the right place. Since 2003, Quality Logo Products has offered high-quality imprinted items at amazing prices." Totally different tone than Business Insider, right? We've been introduced to the fact that this website is organized around selling things, and specifically selling things to you that you can then kind of sell or give to other people. It's all about branding. And it kind of their updated About Us page, when I kind of have kind of kept screenshots of these. The Quality Logo Products website lists in their About Us page now, we put your logo on cool stuff. So they have a header that really gets to the point in a concise and clear and direct way. And it reads now in this updated description, "If you want your logo printed on cool stuff like t-shirts, water bottles, and stress balls, you're at the right place. Since 2003, Quality Logo Products has offered high quality items at affordable prices. Plus, we make ordering super easy for you with no hidden fees and lightning fast delivery." So very much language of sell, 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 sell. And they're really trying to impress on you that you can put your design or your logo on something that they provide in terms of the object. So you can see that also here represented in the image they've gone with, which shows your design here written across all of these different things. We now also get the kind of updated version of the website, provides us with background on their story of who they are as a company and kind of their history of how they came to be, which is a common technique when thinking about kind of family-owned businesses, or a technique for thinking about how to personalize, not to use that language of like branding, but how to personalize or kind of make more familiar, right, a company to an individual, and to make the company feel more like a real person or real people. And then they provide their statistics of kind of their success and then kind of background on, how they've grown since their initial founding. And it's a quite lengthy revision they've done to the website that provides all of this information on kind of who they are as people. Now we're going to go ahead and pursue this pause and watch section once again. As a reminder, this is another lengthy lecture intermission that if you are somebody who needs a stretch or a snack, this is a great moment to pause this lecture and go do so. And for those of you who are staying with me, with this pause and watch, this particular segment I've included here is from CBS This Morning from 2015. And it really dives into the nitty-gritty of what does the Made in America label really mean. I think it builds really beautifully on the ABC News segments that are linked earlier in this presentation. And it is very helpful if after talking about qualified and unqualified claims, you're just like, I don't know what's going on. So I very much enjoyed this one and highly recommend that you look at it. And then this pause and watch segment from WMAR2 News from 2017 really hones in on the claims part of Made in the USA, which I find to also be really helpful to kind of listen to and watch following our discussion of that section of Mertes' article, or piece, I should say. Okay, so then this final section that I have for you is visualizing definitions of Americanness. All right, and with this section, what we are now going to transition to in this final part is talking about the music videos that you have for this week. So you've done all of this reading to get a kind of clearer sense and stronger sense of made in the USA and how it's used in an economic standpoint. And now we're going to transition to thinking a little bit about how your primary sources for the week are using this terminology of kind of American made, made in the USA, made in America, and repurposing it to provide us with kind of a visual definition for how people and professions and places and things and so on fit into or do not fit into that particular phrase, okay? So the first primary source that you have for this week is Carrie Underwood's All-American Girl, which was posted on October 2nd, 2009 to YouTube, and it is from her album Carnival Ride, which was released in 2007. So as I mentioned before, of course, YouTube has not always enjoyed high definition. So you, of course, have a video that is a little bit suffering in that department. But just to kind of guide you as you prepare to write your discussion board post number 2 for this week, and as a reminder, you're writing about one text. It could be a music video. It could be one of the articles. One text, that's all you're writing about. But I just wanted to kind of track through a couple of interesting things to kind of look out for. And I encourage you, after watching this lecture, to rewatch the music videos and reskim the articles before diving into the discussion board post. But a few things to kind of be thinking about as you are watching this music video or reflecting on watching this music video. We do have Carrie Underwood as our protagonist or narrator, as the person who is singing the song, but also it seems to be the main character. We're seeing her kind of go throughout her life and talk about her life experiences as this character, right? And we see that there are many sequences that change, and that setting and costuming is incredibly important to each of these different moments we get in the video, right? We see Carrie Underwood kind of undergo different career changes over time. We see her in a bunch of different, costumes, such as being an artist or painter. We see her as an Olympic swimmer. We also see her as kind of the matriarch or kind of the mother of the nuclear family with the 2 children and then her husband, right? So as you're watching this music video, I want you to really consciously reflect on what is the significance potentially of seeing this kind of story about All-American Girl, as the song title is kind of defining for us. What is the significance or kind of point to Carrie Underwood taking on all of these costumes? What do these costumes signify? What do they allow her to perhaps step into? And how does representing all of these professions become relevant to what Carrie Underwood is arguing or defining as Americanness, or kind of what constitutes an American girl specifically, right? That's what she's really invested in here. And what does it mean that she's the kind of proxy or like the one that occupies that role throughout the video? What is significant about us getting to see her transformation into a mother? What is the kind of significance of the setting of the household and being in front of it? How does family factor into the narrative throughout this text, right? And we have multiple generations that are represented, and why might that be relevant as well? And thinking about how, one might go about defining what it means to be American or an American girl. What are kind of the expectations, or even just kind of what are some of the suggestions that Carrie Underwood is making here about kind of the responsibility of the American girl. And I definitely encourage you to also think about how, this figure of the American girl is represented across other mediums, whether that's dolls like Barbie or American Girl, or how we might also think about kind of American girls represented in film like Shirley Temple and so on, okay? Your second primary source is Toby Keith's Made in America, which was posted to YouTube on July 28, 2011. It is from his 2011 album, Clancy's Tavern. Now, as I mentioned in the overview lecture, Toby Keith is very well known for being kind of a very America-heavy creator. He's very focused on military service, on veterans, on kind of being patriotic. Americanness is really just kind of embedded in his artistic identity, okay? And it seems that he suggests that it's also embedded in his personal identity as well. Now, we have kind of throughout this text an interweaving of live concert footage alongside sort of pre-recorded kind of sequences or pan-overs of rural America and a kind of different farmland area. We can see here that oftentimes we'll get kind of a split screen design to how this video is organized. I would love for you to be really attentive to that. Like, how is this music video using color, right? What sequences are in black and white? what sequences are, in full color, how our lighting cue is at that live concert, really kind of facilitating some of these kind of Americanness images and visuals. We have multiple generations represented in this video once again. What is the significance of that, and how is Toby Keith and his lyrics perhaps enhancing the impact of those lyrics through who he's electing to show in the music video, right? I also want you to really be thinking about kind of when video is overlaid over other video, what might be the purpose of that? Why does Toby Keith and his creative team want us to see all of these visual details at once? With the Carrie Underwood video, we really are encouraged to kind of focus on one costume profession scene at a time, right? But with the Toby Keith, we're really getting a lot of mixing and matching together. And in his lyrics, he's really thinking about, and he's really making conscious reference to many American-made products. So I want you to consider with the Toby Keith, how he is really engaging with some of those questions that can kind of come up from the Mertes and the Green articles, right? About kind of what constitutes American made. Toby Keith is really pursuing that in terms of products and how the people that use those products are thinking about themselves, perhaps in very specific ways as a result of intentionally consuming them, okay? Again, I want you to think about the kind of live concert footage. I don't want you to just glance over it. It's really important to kind of contemplate the set design. We will talk about kind of live set design once again in a later week when we talk about Megan Thee Stallion's Savage remix. But here we want to really think about how he's kind of designing the stage. How is the crowd able to engage with that stage? How do the lighting design and lighting cues really facilitate some of that excitement and enthusiasm as well? Your third primary source is Demi Lovato's Made in the USA, which was posted to YouTube on July 17th, 2013, and it is from her 2013 album, Demi. Now, this text, like I said before, typically isn't the most popular with students in terms of kind of providing a definition for Americanness. Some students are critical that like the lyrics in the video don't necessarily match up kind of in the same way we'd see with the Carrie Underwood and the Toby Keith. That's fine. That's why it's included here. There are definitely some visual symbols that give us some Americanness. And I want you to be attentive to how the lyrics are perhaps a little bit more broad or generalized compared to the Keith and the Underwood, okay? So it's very helpful to kind of consider how costuming and setting play a role here. We're getting a lot of denim, we're getting a lot of American flag clothing, right? I want you to think about the setting of kind of the carnival, how the kind of red, white, and blue colors might be coming through in the setting as well as in the costuming, right? I want you to also consider how in this text, we have Demi Lovato as narrator, but not as protagonist. What might be the significance or benefit of that, or the confusion of that, right? Does she factor into the story world of this music video treatment at all? Or is he or she perhaps, singing something and then we're seeing visuals that help to translate that? So consider the role of kind of the love story. And once again, that, in each of these three music videos, we see relationships between people represented, some of which are family, some of which are romantic, right? What might be the kind of reasons for that? And how might those couplings or those family dynamics perhaps reinforce the nuclear family, heteronormativity, right? Do we see any queer representation? Do we see any representation of kind of a non-traditional family, right? How might these videos be kind of visually enforcing some of those definitions of family and love as well, and how those factor into Americanness? We also have military representation in this music video. You might want to consider kind of the significance of that. What kinds of military representation are we getting here as opposed to in the Toby Keith, right? We have, in this week's primary sources, we have representation of veterans and active duty military. So it would be important to kind of contemplate how lighting, how, the song and so on and so forth are really perhaps extending the potentials for identifying with or empathizing with those figures. And finally, your fourth primary source is MKTO's American Dream, which was posted to YouTube on April 28th, 2014, and is from their album MKTO, which was put out in 2014. Now, this music video is one that, as I mentioned in the overview lecture, is once again giving us kind of multiple perspectives like we saw with something like the Jeremy Zucker video in week 1. I want you to contemplate, much like the Carrie Underwood, what kinds of professions or passions are being represented here? Who is living those passions? Do we have kind of the two band members of MKTO operating as narrators or as main characters? Are they participating at all in the story world of the music video? or are they commenting on or kind of making legible for us the story world through their lyrics? I want you to kind of contemplate, what for each of these individual narratives, what do we see for each of them, right? Do they all end in happy endings? Do they have complicated trajectories? How are the lyrics perhaps providing us with a foundation upon which the music video treatment or the story, right, then expands upon or complicates or builds out those lyrics a bit more, right? Because we have quite a bit of variety in this music video, and quite a few side characters who are kind of following along with their various pursuits, okay? I wish to also consider in each of these 4 music videos, but especially here, we also have kind of performance footage, once again, different than the Keith, of course, in the sense that we don't have them performing in front of a crowd necessarily, but we do have sequences where kind of the 2 band members are singing to the camera, they're performing with their band, right? So I want you to kind of contemplate what might be the relevance or the usefulness of including those clips in the video. Do they add anything? Do they help us in any way, right? Do they kind of disrupt or extend the organization of the video's clips that we get with the other narratives? Think about all of those different details and how they perhaps complicate or add to kind of even color explorations of red, white, and blue in relationship to Americanness, okay? So that is everything that I have for you today. I hope that this lecture was helpful for you as you begin thinking a little bit more about kind of just made in America, made in the USA, as terms that we might casually use, but actually have a lot of different layers and facets to them. I hope that this lecture also kind of helps to just indicate that these terms are not as clear cut as they might be kind of suggested to be, and that this terminology is one that can kind of help us to start to think a little bit about how music videos and how pop culture more broadly is participating in definition making about Americanness, even if it's not exclusively about the financial or economic components of that term. Okay? So this is me, K-Swizzle, signing off for the week, hoping that you are well, hoping that week 2 has been off to a good start. If you have questions for me, I have office hours on Mondays from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern, but you can also email me. You can also call me during my office hours or schedule an alternate time to meet with me, and we can talk about things for the class then. As a reminder, you have discussion board post number 2 as your assignment for this week. But otherwise, we are just getting started, and I'm looking forward to future discussions and writings with you. All right, everyone, have a good rest of your week. I hope that you take care and have a great summer. Bye.